As we transition the discussion from the state perspective to the national perspective, this session is entitled National Perspectives on College Access and Readiness, and it will be moderated by Dr. Dan Connell. I've been asked to introduce Dr. Connell, and that's an honor I'm not worthy of. Dr. Connell has a amazing background, and I'm going to keep it a little short on the list of things that he has done. But when I got to the part that says he has been with TRIO for 34 years, it's a pretty amazing accomplishment. In addition, he has been the, principal investigator for Gear Up and Gear Up 2. He is by far the best definition of a yes man, in that you can go and sit down with Dr. Connell and bring him the strangest of obstacles, and he will figure out a way to make it possible, make it fit, and find the funding. I hate to put you on the spot. I know people are going to be chasing you out the door for that one. But let me read a little of his actual accomplishment. Dr. Connell's affiliation with TRIO began in 1978 as director of the Educational Opportunity Center at the Kentuckiana Metroversity in Louisville, Kentucky. His current position as the Assistant Vice President for Adult Education and College Access at Morehead State University. He oversees the Educational Opportunity Center, the Student Support Services, Talent Search, Upward Bound Math Science programs, state, local, and university adult education programs, college access programs, in addition to serving as, of course, the principal investigator for our Gear Up program. He has been the president of the Southeastern Association of Educational Opportunities, Program Personnel, National Education Opportunity Center Association, and the Kentucky Association of Educational Opportunity Program Personnel. He is the chair of the Kentucky College, or was the chair of the Kentucky College Access Network, and a former member of the Council for Opportunity and Education's Board of Directors. Without further ado, Dr. Dan Connell.
I was very humbled by those marks. Appreciate that. Well, you heard, I think, a challenging panel, and challenged us to be committed and not to give up on our kids and our adults, because I have an adult background, so I want to say that. But now we're going to switch a little bit to the national perspective and maybe look at how we can be effective advocates on locally, but then how we can influence policy at the national level. Because our job is not only to work with our students and help them, but also our job is to be advocates on the state and the national levels when it comes to policy. And so that's what this panel is going to talk about. I am really honored to be able to introduce this panel to you, because on this panel you have a wealth of skill, knowledge about college access and success and college and career readiness. You have people who have been involved in this actually longer than I have, 34 years. There's people here that are have many more years, and there are people who are advocates on the national level, and they will share with you their, I guess, knowledge, and also share with you the current climate and scene on the national levels when it comes to college access and success. So first, I want to introduce to you, sitting here, right next to me, is Nathan Monell. And Nathan is right now the Executive Director of the National Council for Community and Educational Partnerships. He's been in that role since January of 2011. Before that, he was the Chief Executive Officer of Foster Care Alumni of America, which is a national association of adults who experience foster care as children. We had breakfast together today, and his bio is in the program, and you can read that. But what I was most impressed about was his real genuineness and commitment to the types of students that we serve. He is extremely dedicated to working with and making change both at the national level and at the program level to see that our students get the opportunities that they so much deserve. And so would you please join me in welcoming Nathan Monell. Now we have a late addition to the panel, and that is Miss. That, and also someone who I've known for over 34 years, and that is Maureen Hoyler. And Maureen is the Executive Vice President at the Council for Opportunity in Education. And Maureen is also a tireless advocate. She began her career in educational opportunity programs at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And she, from that day forward, even as a student, I believe, we heard stories about Maureen as a student today. No, we can't tell those stories. But even as a student, I can tell you she was an advocate for change. And she has dedicated her career to doing that. She came to Washington, D.C. on a prayer and a hope of making a difference and making a change in students' lives. And she used some of her own personal money, and many times, sometimes in the early days, went without a paycheck to advocate for people on our behalf. And now she's one of the most respected advocates in the Washington, D.C. area, and I think with the U.S. Department of Education in her advocacy role there, she's built some bridges and done some amazing things. She's also the proud parent of 2 children, one who's getting married. We're waiting for that celebration. So please welcome Maureen Hoyler, who's great to see you. Seated next to her is Dr. Arnold Mitchum. And Dr. Mitchum, I also have known for 34 years, and is someone who truly has been, for over 40 years, a voice and an advocate for low-income, first-generation disabled students across the nation. He has been an advocate of wanting to create an even playing field for those students who may not have the advantages that some of us or other students have. He also took a great risk and left Marquette University to come to Washington, D.C. to begin the work of the council and to begin to be a major player. And now he advocates and works with the professionals in the TRIO programs. The TRIO programs have grown by over 400% and now are the largest discretionary program in the U.S. Department of Education, dedicated to advocacy for low-income, first-generation, and disabled students. So he has a wealth of information. He is also someone who has some roots in Louisville. Actually, this is the birthplace of his father, was here in Louisville. So it's in some ways kind of coming back home for him. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Arnold Mitchum. And we're going to just start off the panel. I'm going to ask one of them a question and then ask the other 2 panelists to kind of respond to the question and add their comments, and then we'll have maybe 5 minutes at the end for just questions from the audience. There are a couple microphones set up, and I'm giving you plenty of warning this time that Dr. Thompson, maybe he sprung that on you and you didn't have questions, but now you can be thinking of your questions. The first question is, and we'll direct this one to Dr. Mitchum, we'll start there, that what are the changes that you have seen in the college access movement on the national level since its beginnings in the 1960s with the Higher Education Act and the Economic Development Act and the Civil Rights Act, which was a springboard for much of this? How has that changed in the last 50 years?
Thank you very much, Dan, for that question. As you might imagine, things have changed considerably in the last 40, 50 years. What strikes me perhaps the most is that the perception that higher education is just a personal good is very different from the perception and the rationale that was incorporated into the Higher Education Act and into the legislative debates and to a lot of the discussion that occurred in the 1960s. Whereas higher education, equal educational opportunity, was viewed as a public good. There was a notion that by educating other people's children, not only would we improve the life chances and the quality of life for our own children, but indeed we'd enrich and empower our communities. That began to shift in the early 80s. That is the most significant thing that I have noted. What I've also noted is that we have moved away from in terms of the federal government seeing itself as the guarantor of opportunity. We see it's very much, we see that in the behaviors of this particular administration, the competitive approach they're taking to rewarding some states and withholding resources to others. I know as academics we can admire merit and all of that, but we must keep in mind that the underlying rationale, the premise of the Higher Education Act in 1965 and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1964 was that we want to provide an equal opportunity for every American, irrespective of their political jurisdiction, irrespective of their domicile, irrespective of their background. And indeed, the particular policy that we're currently pursuing indeed do not accord with that. The other thing that I note is that as we think about the time that I sort of walked on the stage in Washington, which wasn't in 1965, but rather more in 1974, 75, there seemed to be a more allegiance or attention, or at least in the rhetoric, of compulsions are driven by what I would phrase as a moral imperative, a moral imperative. That a lot of the things we're doing, we're not driven by economic necessity. That has changed. That has changed radically, and certainly that was articulated very eloquently in the panel that we just heard. Now there is an economic imperative, very real imperative, and that creates some other kind of problems and issues, and maybe we'll get into that, Dr. Connell, in some other questions.
Maureen or Nathan, would you like to?
Well, I'm older than Nathan, so I will just add one piece that I think is different. In the 70s, 60s, the notion that everyone needed to go to college was not, nobody believed that. People believed that some people, and particularly among low-income people, the best and the brightest of low-income people should have the opportunity to go to college and the obstacles removed. Now, at least the rhetoric is that college should be available, should be really something that we provide to everyone. And so that's a big difference. Now, whether or not we're in saying that we're accepting a kind of a dual system of higher education is a question you have to kind of go to. But the notion that all children should have access to college is something that did not exist in the 70s. So it really changes kind of the role of outreach and access programs, because in the 70s they might work with subpopulations of a school, and now the challenge is to work with a larger group of people. Nathan?
We were joking at lunch that in the 60s I was in elementary school, so I wasn't there. I think we have to look at what we hope to accomplish with each of those areas of legislation, and some wonderful things came out of it. Some of the college access work that we're all doing came out of that legislation. Certainly work study, subsidized student loans, Pell Grants, all came as a result of trying to drive affordability. I think with any legislation, long term, we have to look at what the impact is. So have we accomplished what we set out to do? And if you look at college graduation rates now, it's exactly what you'd expect it to be without any help from the outside. Asian Americans graduating at about 58%, whites graduating about 36%, African Americans about 18%, Latinos about 12%, Native Americans at 10%. So we would hope that when we had that legislation in place, we might see more impact on our communities. And I think for us, moving forward, I totally agree with what Dr. Mitchum said about the current environment, and the rhetoric in the current environment is not about moral imperatives or equity for all students, making sure that everybody has the equal opportunity to succeed. Our biggest hope in advocacy right now is in the economic imperatives. It's in global competitiveness. But we cannot let go, those of us who care about the families that we're dealing with cannot let go of the well-being of the students that we're working with, that the opportunity for them to go to college will change their lives and the lives of generations to come. We all know that just 1 year of college is enough to break the cycle of poverty, and we don't have that kind of discussion being had very much. So I think what we ought to be talking about is kind of where we go forward with these issues. I think it'd be unfortunate not to mention that we have many undocumented students who were not served by some of these issues. We have students who have huge disincentives not to study hard in high school, to move on to college and graduate. When they leave, they're looking at a very uncertain work future, and I think in order to address certainly the Latino population and their graduation rates, we're going to have to look at immigration issues as well as future legislation like the DREAM Act.
Thank you. To follow up what Nathan just said, I'd like to maybe ask Maureen to start with to comment what you do see as the future. I think Nathan identified some areas of the future of college access, some of the problems, issues that need to be addressed. And maybe just think about, we talked about the history, started with a little bit on the future. If you could maybe respond where you see the future for college access.
I guess the future is in everybody in the room. Nothing is going to survive unless people scream pretty loud. And nothing is going to expand unless people are organized. And so if people act and see advocacy as a major part of their responsibility when they sign up to work in Gear Up or TRIO and Gear Up will expand and serve more students and become better. And if they don't, it won't happen. And I think it's that simple. One thing you learn in Washington is that it's hard for any administration to buy into, it's hard to have long-term commitment to anything. And unless people are held to their commitments, there won't be any commitments. And so, absent organization, we're in trouble. With organization, I think we can expand and serve more students.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Connell. I'm not very optimistic about the future, and I'm sorry to have to say that, but I have to be candid with you all. As I look at access and success moving forward, I see our programs being eroded. I see the quality of the programs being diminished. And much of that, of course, is a function of lack of resources. And that is kind of a call that Maureen just mentioned, that those of us who work with low-income and first-generation students, it's incumbent upon us that we become much more active than we have been in the past. This is a very difficult time for the country. It's a very difficult time for us, but it's even worse for the individuals whom we've committed our lives to serve, who are the low-income, first-generation, and disabled students. We have to serve as proxies for those folks. Service is wonderful. We must improve our service. We must be more effective. We must be more efficient. But at the same time, we'd be irresponsible if we were not better advocates. That's what they need. We're fighting for resources in a very difficult time in our life of the country. And that's the role and responsibility, I think, that we as TRIO, Gear Up, educators have to assume and adopt.
Yeah, the immediate future looks a little dismal at best. You know, we're right now facing sequestration, and you all know what sequestration is, the Budget Control Act, because Congress could make some decisions about how they wanted to deal with entitlements and defense spending. They kind of kicked the can down the road, and that means that we had the threat of sequestration facing us in January of 2013. And basically what that would do for our segment where our funding comes is pretty drastic. So non-defense discretionary funding, which is the pool we're in, that's everything not for defense. It's everything discretionary, not mandatory, like entitlements and other programs that are mandatory. And that pool, it's only about 3.4% of the GDP. So it's a very small part of the whole expense of the federal government. But that group will receive budget cuts of 8.6 to 10% through sequestration, depending on whose numbers you're using. And so an immediate short-term loss is very possible for all of us. So if you look at a 10% loss for Gear Up in the state of Kentucky, we have about $18 million in Kentucky. So you do the math on that, 10%, that's $1.8 million potential loss for Gear Up in Kentucky. We know that every time we lose $20 million in Gear Up, that's 40,000 students that don't get served. And we already know that the demand does not meet the need. So the last, I'm sure Dr. Mitchell and Maureen can address this from a TRIO perspective. I don't know their numbers, but I do know that the last application round for Gear Up, the number of grantees that were qualified to be funded that weren't funded would have served 1 million students. And so the pool of funds is not large enough already to serve demonstrated need where communities have already developed plans to go ahead and create Gear Up programs. And there's not enough resources to begin with. So we start chunking away at that. You know, we already lost 20 million from Gear Up. Since 1998, Gear Up funding has been pretty level. It's been about 300 million, and we had about a $20 million bump for a short period. And we lost that 20 million with our friends, some of our friends. And so, you know, when we were going through fiscal year 2011, President Obama, Speaker Boehner, and Harry Reid were all sitting behind closed doors and negotiating what we're going to do with the budget in some very tight times. And for all we knew, we were in great shape for Gear Up that year, and we lost $20 million when they came walking out of those doors. There is a change in the way the whole budgeting process is working on the federal level, and so the formal ways that we used to develop budgets, both in the Senate and the House, are no longer being done the ways they used to be done. And so the ability for advocates to step in and make the right statements at the right time is getting more challenging. But Dr. Mitchell is very correct. If we do not engage advocates who can make the federal investment in the local community very real, the story will get worse. And I think among our friends, so, you know, this is not friends like partisan friends. This is among our friends. Education's always been bipartisan. There's always been people on both sides of the aisle who saw the importance of creating the best opportunity for all students. But even among our friends, college access is becoming much more of a survival of the fittest. States who can put together the strongest applications, who have the best resources, put the great applications together like Kentucky did and like Vermont, who's sitting out here. And there are many parts of the country where there are programs that are way more needed, locations that are way more needed, a partnership region that needs the services very badly. But they have great difficulty competing for these federal funds because they don't have the sharpshooter grant writers that you have here in Kentucky. So I think from our friends' point, when they're being very competitive, when they're saying the survival of the fittest, the best ones should survive and the rest can go away, I think that really shows that the moral imperative's not there. We need to return that so we understand that every student has a right to advance ready to go to college.
We would like to welcome Dr. Jim Applegate, the Luna Foundation, Indianapolis.
Thank you. My apologies. The I-65 from Indy to here was an obstacle course, 3 accidents and road construction. It took me an hour and a half longer than I thought it was going to take me, so I apologize.
We are glad you're here, though. And this is a good a good segue, because I think we're starting to talk about obstacles that we're facing on the national level. So that was good.
Maybe it wasn't labeled the College Access Highway, but maybe that should be labeled that.
Access Highway. We were just talking about, on the national level, losing our moral imperative for college access and some of the funding issues that are facing us now. From a foundation's perspective on college access, how do you see the importance of college access, and what role do you see foundations serving for college access?
Well, I mean, I think from our perspective at the foundation, I do believe there is a growing momentum among the whole entire foundation community around the importance of, I would call it the completion agenda for higher education. That is, that we have to have millions more people, actually we would say 23 million more people than we're on track to produce, with high quality post-secondary degrees and credentials by 2025. That's what we call our goal 2025. I think we're getting a lot of buy-in on that. The president has talked about that. But to do that, I think what has to be made clear is to do that requires massive increases in the number of people going to college, and then tremendous improvements in the throughput for those students who actually go. So from our perspective, access is absolutely essential. And if you want to look at where those 23 million additional degrees are going to come from, and I talked on the side to some of why that's so important to our economy and to our democracy, they're all going to have to come from the students that we are not doing a very good job of getting into and through college right now. They have to come from first-generation students, low-income students, students of color, and adults coming back to college. If you look at the 2010 census, and look at a startling statistic you can pull from there. Among 24-year-olds in this country in 2010, which, kind of the little bit post-college age, in the upper income quartile of this country, 79% of 24-year-olds in the upper income quartile, or almost 4 out of 5, have a 4-year college degree. Among those in the lowest income quartile, 11%. So unless you believe that the wealth of the family into which you're born makes you 8 times more capable of completing college, and we know the real tragedy of that at this stage of the game is that we know today in this economy that without some form, it doesn't have to be 4-year, but without some form of college credential, a high school diploma by itself is simply a ticket to being working poor. That is about the best you can hope for. So a writer in the New York Times recently talked about higher ed as functioning to reproduce privilege. And it is aggravated by the fact that the college degrees are worth more now than they ever were, and we're still only giving them to the rich people. We do a pretty darn good job in this country of educating wealthy people. So if you want to talk about how we're going to go from 40% of our population with a post-secondary credential, where we've been stuck for 30 years, to 60%, and where we're going to get those people when Korea just hit 65%, Canada's pushing towards 60%. It's not that we haven't declined over the last 30 years. We've just gone nowhere. We've been in idle. And the only way we're going to get out of idle is with programs like TRIO programs and Gear Up programs, working in consort and aligned with success programs to make sure that we create pathways for 23 million more students, largely first generation, students of color, adult learners coming back to college, and low income, so that their aspirations to college begin early, and the handoff from high school to college is seamless and strong. That's our perspective.
Any comments on Nathan?
Well, I think one of the things that we're particularly interested in, as you know, many of the Gear Up grants are partnership grants, which involve universities who are often the lead on the partnership grants. We're particularly interested in that handoff between students who are finishing and going on to their first year of college. And as you know, many of you know, Gear Up now allows us to follow students into their 7th year. And we're very interested in looking what happens to our first generation students and tracking how they perform when they go into the universities or the colleges or the community colleges. So when we look at that, some of the things that we're very interested in studying, and we'd love some partnership support with TRIO and also foundation support on this, but is looking at what are the unique special support services that are needed by our students when they go on to college. So we all know, all of you who are out there running college access programs, you know the kind of individual supports you're providing to the students, psychosocial supports, bringing in community partners from college access networks to work with you to help students complete and get and enroll in college ready and prepared. But what do we need to be doing in the university setting to make that happen? One of the things that we've been doing is looking at some of the programs for doing that. And you know, most of the parental engagement programs, for instance, that is one of the pieces we'd want to be offering for support. Most of the parental engagement programs at the university level are really about engaging the parents to become donors. And so that's really a sad state about what we're trying to do for parental engagement on the university level. And we're also very concerned about how we can use that bridge of our partnership grant holders, the universities, to bridge between the student population in high school and the student population in college. And so when you have, for instance, an example like the University of Texas Pan American, where their Office of Student Services is also the Gear Up grant holder, it's amazing in that kind of a community where you've been working with the students all along as middle school students and then high school students, and then they're also walking in the door of your university. And when they need supports, they're walking into the Gear Up office, even in cases where the Gear Up office isn't serving them anymore, and saying, gosh, I need this level of support. So I think we need to work with our university and college systems to say, what have we learned as college access professionals in the middle and high school years that will inform how to drive completion when we're done? And you know, there's some good sides and downsides to the college completion issue. One of them being that it's the best interest of our students who are low income to get in and out at 4 years as quickly as they quick as they possibly can with as little remediation as possible. The challenge for that is we see more pressure on university systems to get students in and out faster. We want to make sure that there's no creaming so that our students who may have to work more, may have to have more jobs, are not the ones who are not as accepted as often into university systems because they might lower the scores of completion.